Thank you all very much for having me here today. It's an honor to come share this project. And I want to thank you on behalf of both the Untermyer Gardens Conservancy and the City of Yonkers. For those of you that aren't familiar with this space, it is a city-owned park. And 10 years ago, a gentleman named Steve Burns, who is a former resident of Yonkers, he's an architect by trade. He's always been very passionate about historical restoration and preservation, and he's a garden enthusiast himself. He had been aware of the gardens for some time, and at one point the city got the fountains in the big walled garden, which we'll take a look at here in a moment, actually up and running. And he said, somebody has to do something. This garden is too important and too interesting to let it continue to fall into a demise that it really had fallen into. And so he formed a nonprofit and started raising money. He hired me back as the first full-time gardener since Untermyer died in 1940, and we've gotten busy. So for the past 10 years, we've been working on this garden passionately and fervently, and it's so much fun. At the same time, I don't hit the snooze on my alarm anymore. I get up and go right to work, and it's hard to leave work as well. So I just wanted to come here and share this with you. Thank you for the opportunity. So what we're going to do today is really take a look through the garden and look at the major historical features that we've restored in the past 10 years, some major historical features that we're looking forward to restoring, and then because even with the rich history of Untermyer and all he left behind, we think we can make some improvements along the way. So there's gardens we want to add to what Untermyer had actually done. So we'll move through here. I do want to tell you a little bit about Mr. Untermyer himself, and you can see here, our original tagline for the garden was Untermyer, America's greatest forgotten garden. You just heard my resume. I worked and lived and gardened in Westchester. I gardened at Wave Hill in the Bronx, and I actually lived in Yonkers during that period of time. I spent 6 years working for Martha Stewart's magazine, where one of my main jobs was just to find really interesting locations for garden photo shoots, if not growing gardens and plants on their own. And I had never heard of Untermyer Gardens until Steve Burns, who I just mentioned, was looking to hire this position. It was a world-renowned garden in its day and had really become completely unknown. How many people today have visited the garden? Wow, that's great. I'm sure my first season working there, if we had 6 people show up on a beautiful spring Saturday afternoon, that was a big amount of people coming in. So already this whole room was bigger than a week's worth of attendance for the first year we started. So we're no longer America's greatest forgotten garden, that's for sure. But Samuel Untermyer bought this property in 1899. He bought it from Samuel Tilghman. That name ring to anybody? He was a New York State governor who also ran for president, and he was the first candidate that he won the popular vote and lost in the Electoral College, which is now's a thing, I guess. He was the first, and it was Rutherford B. Hayes he lost to. Shortly after he lost that election, he put the property up for sale, and Samuel Untermyer bought it in 1899. Samuel Untermyer was an American-born German Jew. His parents were tobacco farmers, but his father died in North Carolina. His father died fairly early in life, and his mother brought the family to New York City, where Untermyer went to Columbia to study law. So that's where he made his money. He was a member of the bar before he was 20 years old. So that tells you a bit about his ambition and his talent. Early in his career, he really focused on corporate merger law, Bethlehem Steel, big copper mining companies. This would have been through the mid and late 1800s, and really became quite successful as a national lawyer at that point. He was rumored to be the first lawyer to ever command $1 million fee from a single case. And again, this is in the late 1800s. And so he went about following his passion of building this garden. You can see in this picture from Life magazine, he has an orchid boutonniere. This is something he did every day. He was known for that. In fact, he would have his driver come down from the greenhouses at Untermyer Gardens in Yonkers with a fresh boutonniere, a fresh orchid every afternoon, along with some out-of-season fruit, which he often bragged about, which is kind of opposite of how we think about food now, that he had also grown in his greenhouses. So he was passionate about orchids. He was passionate about growing in the greenhouse, and he put together this, what turned out to be a 150-acre estate with this fine gardening in it. But a little bit about the man himself and his career. After he became successful as a corporate merger lawyer, he sort of shifted to a more progressive person thinking about how he could better the world. He fought to keep subway tolls low for the common person. And he also, more importantly and more interestingly in a way, in the early 30s, as an American-born German Jew, saw what was happening with Hitler's rise to power in the 30s and tried somewhat unsuccessfully to form a national boycott of Germany very early before the rest of our country woke up to it. He was friends with Albert Einstein, and we have handwritten correspondence where he was petitioning Einstein to help him with the boycott. Einstein's handwritten reply back was, "I want to change the world with my science. I've just gotten the position at Princeton, but I'm sure it's in good hands with you." And so it was all the way up into his death in 1940 that he was trying to wake up the United States and do what he could to stop what was happening in Germany. So a really interesting man. He married a Christian woman, Minnie Untermyer, and I could talk all day just about Untermyer the man, but we came here to talk about his garden a little bit, so we'll do that. Untermyer was looking to put together what he wanted to be the finest garden in the world. This comes from the notes from this man's studio, Wells Bosworth, who was the landscape architect for Kaikut, which is probably how he got on Untermyer's radar. Bosworth was a Beaux-Arts landscape architect. A lot of that's very formal architecture, very linear. The house would be the linchpin. You can see here some of the drawings from Kaikut. However, Untermyer Gardens, for those of you, most of you have been, is sort of a sprawling estate. So it was a bit of a transition for how Bosworth usually gardened. And just a little bit more about Bosworth. Shortly after he finished Untermyer's garden, and before that, he had done the Kaikut, the Rockefeller estate. He'd done the MIT campus as well, some buildings. He did architecture as well as landscape architecture. He did some buildings in New York City. And then Rockefeller took him to France, where he worked at Versailles for a bit on that restoration and spent a lot of time at Notre Dame de Reims, and spent his career mostly in Europe. But he left behind this amazing garden that he partnered with Untermyer to do. And again, in Bosworth's notes, he says, "This interesting man walked into my studio today, Samuel Untermyer, and has commissioned me to design the grandest garden in the world." So that was Untermyer's stated ambition to his designer. This is Bosworth's first and only drawing that we've been able to get our hands on of the estate and how it turned out to look. You can just see at the bottom of that image, perhaps, the main walled garden, which is the main featured garden. And then here was a bit more updated map of how that property looked like. Untermyer bought the property and then started adding to it as he was able to, and added up to 150 acres. So there was the mansion, which is no longer there. For those of you who have been there to the property and looking for the house, it was razed, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. There was a carriage house where the community center sits now. Then the walled gardens, the grand vista stairs going down to a pair of ancient Roman columns to overlook the river. There was a rose and dahlia garden that led out to an Italian vegetable garden, which we'll look at images, and the Temple of Love on the far side of the property, going almost all the way down to the river. So it was a really extensive property. So before he died, Untermyer's children had no interest in taking over the property. He went to the state of New York and offered it to them. They turned him down immediately. He went to the county of Westchester, offered it to them as a county park. He was turned down. He went to the city of Yonkers, and they turned him down as well. He went back to the state one more time, who then commissioned Robert Moses to evaluate it as a state park. And Moses's notes came back and said, while it would be a huge resource as a state park, the level of sophistication of both the horticulture and the architecture are such that it would require a giant endowment. We still haven't figured out where Untermyer's money may have gone. We know he spent a lot of money, of his own money, trying to form this boycott of Germany. His children weren't interested, as I said, so there may not have even been a lot of money left by the time he was passing away. And I'm not sure endowments were as popular in the day as they are now. So there was no money being left behind. He offered it to the county one more time. And when he died in 1940, with no formal arrangements, nothing had been signed, nothing had been agreed to, he left it to the city of Yonkers. Yonkers took 8 years to accept stewardship of the property. So we think that's why the house probably fell into decline, was not being taken care of. The city took it on, and even if the house would have been in pristine shape, they might have knocked it down just because the maintenance it would require to move forward. And they also sold the property down to 16 acres. So again, it was 150 acres originally, and the city immediately sold it down to 16 acres. And so all the grayed out area on this particular image is what was left, what was sold off. And so really only the walled garden and the vista stairs going down toward the river were the only parts left of the garden. In the 80s, and I'm sorry, most of the property was sold off, a chunk of it to St. John's Hospital, which is now looms over us in the background on the corner of Odell and North Broadway there. Maybe some of you are familiar with the hospital. The rest of the property was sold to developers, and 2 in a row, both developers went bankrupt. But we've seen drawings from the 1970s where condos with river views and parking lots and the whole thing had already been drawn up. The architecture drawings had already been drawn up, but both those developers went bankrupt in the 80s, and some local concerned citizens and environmental groups were able to convince the city to buy this now bankrupt property back whenever they could afford it. So we're back up to 45 acres that we're able to get back. We still lost what is now the hospital and the nursing home, but most of the historical aspects of the garden are still intact, and that's what we've been working with. In addition to having 150 acres in his day, Untermyer had 60 full-time gardeners. We have 5 full-time gardeners now, and this year we're going to have 3 seasonals. So we're closing in. We're just 53 short at the moment. And he also had the 60 greenhouses. So that's like 1 greenhouse per gardener, which is crazy math. Any of you that work have any level of a greenhouse. But it just shows how important this garden was to Untermyer. And he and his wife Minnie used the garden, and they opened it to the public once a week. This is an invitation to the 1924 National Democratic Convention for the delegates all to come visit Untermyer for a dinner party, which they did. And so they had performances throughout the garden. They had big dinner parties. And as I just mentioned, they opened it to the public once a week, which is unheard of for a private garden in the early 1900s, long before the Garden Conservancy's open days. So, and then after he died in 1940, it kind of fell into ruin. And this is a handbill for the Untermyer Rock Festival of 1975, sponsored by the Unicorn Pub. So the audience had kind of changed at that point a little bit. But going back to how the garden was, this is a New York Times clipping during the Fall Chrysanthemum Festival that Untermyer would put on, where 30,000 people visited the garden in a single day. I mentioned earlier that if I had half a dozen people visit me on a beautiful spring Saturday in 2011, it was a big crowd. But the sort of renown it had at that point in time and fell into such disrepair and fell off everybody's radar, even a gardener that lived in town, it really is amazing that we almost lost this property. Here you can see some of the demise that happened to those canals through the period between the 40s and 2011. This would have been in the 70s. And this is largely how we're treating the garden today. We're not necessarily confined to Untermyer's exact and Bosworth's exact plans or details or plantings, but we are certainly inspired by that. We want to maintain the stories, and we want to garden it just as lushly as he did. So what I'd like to do now is take you through the historical elements. Those are gardens that Untermyer had created, and talk about what we've restored in the past 10 years. So here again, we're looking at the walled garden, which is the chief feature of the garden. And this was the entrance to the walled garden in Untermyer's time. It had an American elm alley leading to the front and was densely planted across the front of the garden as well. He called this his Greek garden, which isn't really quite fair. It really is an Indo-Persian garden. It was designed based on Indian and Persian themes, Mughal and Moorish themes, sort of something of an oasis, but he called it his Greek garden because within it's appointed with a study of Greek architecture, which we'll look at a little bit more closely. Obviously, all the American elms are long gone, and when we arrived, it was a bit more of a stark planting of the facade of the walled garden. And we kind of like that. We don't think we want to obscure this entrance, but we have put a handful of fastigiate trees sort of to break it up and give it some rhythm and a little bit of dynamics. And you can see inside the walled garden, there's these beautiful weeping beeches that welcome you into the site. Here we're walking through the main entrance, and there is a relief sculpture above the door of Artemis, which is the Greek goddess of the hunt. I kind of curse her name every time I walk through. Our biggest weed at Untermyer, who can guess what it is? Artemisia, which is mugwort. We all have some mugwort, and it's named after her, so I kind of curse her name every time I walk through the door. This is how those canals look once you got inside to this formal overlay. Again, with an Indo-Persian garden, the design theme is to reflect paradise or Eden in some sense. The canals are thought to reflect the four rivers of Eden, or rivers of milk, water, wine, and honey. The four quadrants that are left over by the canals, or divided by the canals, are to represent the four cardinal directions, and the symbolism just kind of goes on with this Indo-Persian garden. In 2011, this is how we found it, with just a few low-growing junipers here and there, and a handful of meatball pruned rhododendron and junipers in the borders. The mulch around those was more construction debris than it really was mulch. The architecture was still there. It was really fascinating. There's a lot of potential, but this whole garden had not been gardened to any merit that reflected Untermyer's vision until we showed up in 2011. And so this is what we're trying to do and bring back a little bit of the flavor of Untermyer's day. I love these drone shots that give you a good perspective of the garden. So on the left of this image, you can see those two big weeping beeches that welcome you into the walled garden after you've mumbled about mugwort and Artemis as you went through. And then you find the four canals. The long canal runs north-south and leads to the big amphitheater, or it's a small amphitheater, so to speak. There is a Corinthian rotunda and a Doric stoa in there as well. You can just see a little bit of a pool that we'll talk about in a moment, but a good overview of it. After Untermyer stopped with horticulture, the gardens were maintained, basically just keeping it clean and mowing the lawn. And so you can see all the rhythmic plantings along the canals several years after Untermyer had passed. So the gardens were clean, but they really weren't a garden anymore. And they fell into further demise as well. So we've tried to take some of the same rhythmic elements that Bosworth and Untermyer had originally designed, and we've had some fun with it and changed it around a little bit. So you can see the fastigiate beeches that are making their way as rhythmic elements all the way up to the weeping beeches, and where those big overgrown yews were, we now are using smaller Japanese hollies. We think this is a bit more in tune with Bosworth's original design than even what Untermyer executed at the time. I talked about how we're not confined necessarily by what Untermyer planted, but it is a National Landmark site, and the State Historic Preservation Office does oversee that landmark status, and so they watch what we're doing exactly. And we're not a restoration or a preservation, we're a rehabilitation. So we have looser parameters in which we can garden within the shadow of what Untermyer and Bosworth had actually done. So those fastigiate beeches, those columnar beeches, when Untermyer was there, were actually lantana topiaries that he would have had to prune all season. They would have had the yellow flowers, and then they had to go back in the greenhouse over winter. Bosworth's original design was for conical conifers to go in there. And we actually proposed that we would find the juniper or some other conical conifer to be that outer rhythmic element. And the state said, no, Untermyer never executed that, what he did with these lantanas. So I had to think, and it seemed to me, after talking to them quite a bit, they were mostly interested in where things were and if they were coniferous or deciduous. So since Untermyer planted these lantana, which, although they're tropical, would be deciduous, and they had these yellow flowers, I had to come up with a plant that might be able to reflect the original design intent of the junipers, the conical evergreens, but still tell that story, which I'm telling right now, by the way, if the state's listening, is I found these columnar beeches that emerge with yellow foliage and keep some yellow tips through. They're deciduous. They have the yellow. And for those of you that have gardened with beeches, they do make good hedge material. You could prune them to the height that those lantana standards were, which would have been 4 to 5 feet, about my height. And that's what I told the state. And they said, sure, plant those. And my whole time, I was going to let them get as tall as the conical evergreens that Bosworth had intended originally. So I think we have a more interesting plant than a juniper or a thuya that's pruned into a conical shape. I just told you the story of the lantana, so we all know Untermyer did it. And I think we end up with a more dynamic plant that does have fall color, that does have an interesting form, and it relates to the beeches in the background. The downside of that, and I don't know if any of you have been dealing with that yet, is the beech leaf disease that we're all starting to see in the past couple of years. Well, it showed up last year, and we're doing everything we can, including some experimental things, to see if we can get rid of this nematode. It's a nematode that, if left unchecked, and maybe even being checked, will cause necrosis. It will kill the plants, including potentially the big weeping beeches that Untermyer planted. So we're really nervous right now about all of that. And my great idea of planting these yellow beeches may not have been the greatest idea. It certainly doesn't speak to diversity within the garden. But here's stepping down into that alley along the canals, looking at the Japanese hollies on the interior and the yellow foliage beeches on the exterior, leading up to those grand European weeping beeches in the background, which is at the entrance gate. Again, looking at that same perspective across the east-west canal, past the Corinthian Rotunda, out to the Hudson River and the Palisades. So we do have this amazing borrowed landscape. If you see in the foreground there, for those of you up close, you can see Drew Schuyler, one of our gardeners, who's currently working on the wisteria on the Doric stoa. And again, just to look down those canals from the entrance, those basins that feed into the canals are almost direct copies of another Indo-Persian garden. I see some people nodding their head. Has anybody visited Alhambra, which would be a Moorish Persian garden? So that's the most well-known Western Persian garden. And then who can tell me what the most well-known Eastern Persian garden is from the Mughal tradition? Maybe the Taj Mahal. So we're not Alhambra, we're not the Taj Mahal, but it's the same design principle. We're America's Taj Mahal. It is the largest Indo-Persian gardens in this hemisphere, we think. So those canals in that particular marble basin that was modeled after Alhambra, you can see there was some effort at planting that happened in the 60s and 70s. That beautiful marble basin is filled with red cannas, and the canals are empty and full of weeds. So I'm not sure exactly what the look was there. We prefer now to put water in those basins and keep our plants out on the canal borders there. So that's how we're looking at. Here you can see how those canals looked again during the Fall Chrysanthemum Festival in Untermyer's age. And there was an attempt at a restoration in the 70s. I kind of call this the tulip tragedy of 1970. And not just because, Untermyer did do a lot of bedding plants, and that was the scheme of the day. And we've played with that a little bit ourselves, and along the canals, we've planted tulips too. We just got the tulip fire, which is a fungal disease that came with our tulips a couple years ago. So we stopped tulips at the moment, but I'm still not sure what those geometric forms out in the lawn were with the tulips. And what's even more interesting about this, on the lower inset of this image, and you guys won't be able to read it, is a bronze plaque that's about a 3x4 plaque on the wall, commemorating this planting of tulips. And for those of you that have grown Dutch hybrid tulips, they sometimes perennialize, and there's a few cultivars that do well, and certainly not like the species or others, but this garden couldn't have lasted, this planting couldn't have lasted more than 3 years. I'm sure within the second year, it didn't look great. It would have been very sparse, but we still have a bronze plaque commemorating the great tulip tragedy of the 1970s. Again, I confess we've used tulips in a similar way in the past. This year we're doing cool season annuals that we're going to plant next week. And so we're avoiding tulips for at least 5 years because of this fungal disease that came with them one year. But instead of doing pure bedding plants like Untermyer did, this is how we treat our annual borders. We have fun. We change them out every year. This was a big Gomphrena year, and we try to make it a bit more romantic, but certainly have fun with it. I hope I get to garden at this spot for at least 20 years. And every year we come up with a different annual scheme. I'm going to have some huge failures because I'm willing to just try almost anything. But I think that's the fun with annuals, is that if you're not trying to have fun with it and you're not trying to be bold with it, you're missing the whole point of annuals. It's like the point is to have fun with color and shape and form and texture. Stepping back and looking at why Untermyer called this his Greek garden, this shot is standing in the Corinthian Rotunda, looking across at a very simple pergola or stoa. It's done in the Doric style of Greek architecture with very simple columns around the top. The wisteria that I mentioned Drew was pruning, it's about to look like this in the next few weeks. And there used to be a sculpture of Aphrodite in Untermyer's day. He had at least 90 sculptures through the garden. Somehow we only have 2 left, and we're not sure where everything went. But that's Yonkers, and being neglected for 70 years will do. So we've sort of turned this into a container garden and a container spot. It's the best spot in the garden to sit and watch the sunset over the Hudson looking west. Stepping back, you can see another version of our canal annuals leading up to the Doric stoa, and through the year, that container planting just gets bigger and better and becomes a really intimate place. Moving down to the north end of the garden, to the amphitheater, which I mentioned earlier, it's thought that this amphitheater was built for Untermyer's wife, Minnie Untermyer, who was a huge patron of the arts. She would have performances here regularly. She and a couple of her friends were given credit for bringing Gustav Mahler to the New York Philharmonic in the early 19-teens when the Philharmonic was floundering. He was only there for a couple years, but really turned around the New York Philharmonic. But she would have quartets and dances and all sorts of performances in this amphitheater. The 2 sphinxes that are on top of the Ionic columns, so we've gone from Doric to Ionic in this particular area of the garden, as far as Greek architecture is concerned, are done by Paul Manship. Does anybody recognize that name at all? Paul Manship. He was a fairly eminent sculptor in his day. He had a studio in Yonkers, and you all know his work because he did the Prometheus Unbound that's at Rockefeller Ice Skating Rink, and some other sort of Art Deco style sculptures that he's quite well known for. In fact, and again, it's small in this image, there's 2 pedestals that are flanking those sphinxes that held 2 more Paul Manships. There was Diana, another goddess of the hunt, so I'm confused by that. There was the Greek goddess and the Roman goddess of the hunts were in the garden. So it's Diana, goddess of the hunt, and she had just released her magic arrow into Actaeon, the mortal hunter, who had come across her bathing, and a mortal is not allowed to see a nude goddess, so she struck him down with an arrow that turned him into a stag. And so horns are emerging in that particular sculpture, and his hunting dogs are turning on him. There's a whole interesting story about a theft of Actaeon and a recovery. It was stolen for scrap metal, and it was reported by an insider. And it made the news because it was Untermyer's garden. Everybody knew Untermyer's garden. It made the news, and so a tip led them, and they found it buried in a scrapyard because the scrapyard owner got worried that he was going to get in trouble, so he buried it trying to hide it. And that story had kind of gone away. These 2 sculptures are now at the Hudson River Museum, and they were in storage. They weren't on display. And I think an intern was going through old newspaper clippings to see what needed to stay in the archives and found the news clipping of the theft. And it turned out the curators had never understood why Actaeon was in such worse shape with some repairs than Diana. They knew they were both at the same spot, purchased at the same time, lived in the same area, but it resurrected that whole story. I've since asked the Hudson River Museum if we can have them back, please. And they politely chuckled at me and said no. So maybe with 3D printing, we'll get some facsimiles up there at some point, but we've lost those manship sculptures for the moment. And on the lower inset, just because it's up there, there's an image of the gardens at Boboli in Italy, and we're pretty sure we can see where Bosworth got his inspiration for these. So he commissioned Manship to carve these Cipollino marble columns, put the Ionic capitals on them, and then carve the sphinxes that protect the amphitheater. There you can just see a little bit more interesting view of those sphinxes and how we've started to garden in the amphitheater. This is how Untermyer gardened it in his day. This was during that fall chrysanthemum festival that he would have annually. So he had cascading chrysanthemums coming down toward the reflecting pool, giant billowing blousy pots all through the amphitheater. And if you look up on top of that wall, the crenellations in the wall are all planted with a pot of cascading chrysanthemums. I'm sure the gardeners had to water those like 3 times a day. I've been in those crenellations. They're not that big to support those plants. So we don't have the greenhouse or the staff of 60 to put out chrysanthemums in that color. But again, we've tried to take the inspiration of what Untermyer did and tell the same story and have the same sort of fun with the particular space. I mentioned Minnie Untermyer would host performances there. One of the regular performances in the amphitheater was the Isadora Duncan Dance Troupe, who performed several times in the Walled Garden, once or twice at the Temple of Love, which we'll look at. And just last year, we were able to get the current iteration of the Isadora Duncan dancers come and perform in the amphitheater for us as well. You might want to keep an eye on us. Again, we're only 10 years old and we've been focused primarily on horticulture, but we are starting to add some programming and events. And so we'll have another music series named for Minnie Untermyer starting this year as well. So if you want to keep an eye on that. So here we're stepping back from the amphitheater a little bit, looking up at those Cipollino marble columns and the sphinxes. And Untermyer never planted in his canals or in these reflecting pools, but we've tried to take an opportunity to go ahead and turn these into an aquatic space. Some years we just make it look like a naturalistic bog. Other years we have fun with geometry. Again, gardening should be fun. So I think that's a big point of it. And then here we're standing up in the amphitheater looking back across the main axis and the Ionic columns. And over on the right, you can see the Corinthian Rotunda. This is how it looked in Untermyer's day, fully planted with those young plantings. This is largely how we found it. Underneath the Corinthian Rotunda is a mosaic with a Medusa in the middle of it. We haven't had, and we still don't have the money to properly restore everything at the gardens. In fact, the gardeners, our staff, are the ones that have been trying to piece some things back together. I'm learning a bit of masonry along the way, but we're trying to maintain the mosaic. Every year we clean and scrub, re-grout and seal it as part of our gardening routine. But the mosaics are thought to be the largest use of outdoor mosaics in the Northeast. And for some of those you visit, we have a pool that we're going to talk about here in a little bit too, as far as mosaics are concerned. Just over the past 2 years, we were working on a restoration of the Corinthian Rotunda. You can see on the left, and we just were able to unveil that last year. So the rotunda is back in good shape. The mosaic underneath it is as good a shape as gardeners can make it. And we're moving on from there. You can see the Palisades and the river just in the background, and again our canal annual plantings as it leads down to the second level of the walled garden, which is the lower terrace, which we've turned into a hydrangea border. But it's not all hydrangeas. We didn't want to just put together a trial garden, so we have old hydrangeas, new hydrangeas, big, small, macrophyllus. I don't know about you guys. Are the macrophyllus coming through for you this winter? I haven't even been able to check yet. We've used a lot of macrophyllus, but they keep getting killed all the way to the ground over the past number of years. But anyway, we're having a lot of fun with hydrangeas in there, but we also have a lot of companion plants. There's all sorts of other shrubs and a whole interesting perennial underplanting that goes with that. But stepping out of the walled garden to the grand feature of the vista, and this is the back loggia of that lower terrace. And the first time I walked through, I thought it was a dead end. I almost didn't even want to go up into the loggia, but our president, Steve Burns, was full steam ahead. I'm like, why are we going there? It's a dead end. And you come across this gate at the end of the loggia, and then it opens up to what in Untermyer's day was this grand alley of cryptomeria going down to the river. He had asked Bosworth to recreate this modeled after his favorite resort in Italy, which was the Villa d'Este on Lake Como, with the lake in the background and the mountains behind that. And it's almost a direct replica in scale of Untermyer's vista down to the Hudson River with the Palisades in the background. So it's like they picked up a piece of Italy and threw it right in the middle of Yonkers. This is how we found it in 2011. The cryptomeria were all gone. You couldn't see the columns that frame the bottom of the view. And at least 64 Norway maples had grown up to a semi-mature size. in the meantime. So we cut down 64 Norway maples. A lot of it went through my wood-burning stove, and we replanted cryptomerias, just as Untermyer did. The Villa d'Este had Italian cypress, obviously, or obviously we can't grow those in North America, in northern North America. So Untermyer planted cryptomeria, the Japanese cedar. I'm sure they would have been straight species at that time, or maybe not, but we've planted a cultivar called radicans, which should only get 10 feet wide. It's a bit more emerald green. It's more wind resistant for any of you that have had the tops of your cryptomeria or Japanese cedars burn out in some of these winters with a cultivar called Yoshino. And it also doesn't dry out in the center like a lot of cryptomerias do, where the old leaves turn brown and you always see that. So it's supposed to be an improved cultivar. And I was really hoping so, because I hadn't grown it, but I bought 99 of them and put them right on the banks of the Hudson River, where we get all that wind and cold blowing up. But for more than 6 years now, almost 7 years for some of them, they've come through quite nicely. So it's turned into a really nice LA.
Chop them off at all?
No.
Let them grow?
They're supposed to get to 10 feet wide. I planted them on 10 feet centers because we want them to touch. 35 to 40 feet in height is their maximum height, and we don't want to top them. About pruning these, when Untermyer planted his LA, he planted them in the center of those stone walls where we have the yellow Japanese forest grass, the Hacknod growing. So even in his day, that would have congested the path. And again, it was a private estate, so 1 or 2 people walking down would have been fine, but we want four people to be able to walk down there side by side. And it started to choke off the view of, I mentioned the Cipollino columns that Manship built in the walled garden. At the bottom of this vista are ancient Cipollino Roman columns. So they're 2,000-year-old columns that Untermyer got from Stanford White's estate. And we wanted to maintain that wide open view. So we planted the cryptomeria on the outside of the stairs as opposed to the inside of the stairs, which gave us the opportunity to plant that yellow ribbon of grass all the way down, which I think turned out really well for a very simple planting and a simple space. Here you can see where those ancient Roman columns were down by the river. Again, more trees had sort of obscured it. The drain in that landing was completely clogged. So every time it rained, it would get a few inches of water in it. So we were able to clean that up. And again, these ancient Roman columns framing the Hudson River and the Palisades, especially in the fall, is quite stunning. Stepping off of the vista, or between those columns on the vista and looking down at the old gatehouse, you can just see it off to the right, and that's after a winter where I cleaned it up. There were fallen trees and weeds. From this location, between those ancient Roman columns, you would not have been able to see that gatehouse at all. And we talked a lot about what we should do with it. And my first thought was, turn it into the gardener's cottage, please. The head gardener should live there. It just needs a roof and some plumbing, and I'll move right in. I got the same response that you're giving me now. And so we weren't sure what to do other than clean it up. So here it is. It sits right next to the old Croton Aqueduct, just immediately adjacent to the aqueduct. So there's a lot of people using that trail, a lot of traffic that goes by there. And again, it was completely covered. Nobody even knew that there was a garden up there. But we really, at the very least, knew we wanted to transform it into the lower entrance to the garden. The Metro North train station, Greystone Station, is nearby. So we wanted to create an access point here and welcome people into the garden. You can see the remains of a sculpture that we thought was a headless horse that had lost its head that's there. And after some help with some Boy Scouts cleaning it up, we were able to clean that whole area up. Still not sure what to do with it. We had a sculptor come in and redo the head for the what we thought was the horse. And we had some really good pictures, and it looked like a horse. And does anybody know Barbara Israel? She's a dealer in garden antiques, and she's also on our board. So she's very familiar with statuary and everything. And apparently she's a unicorn taxonomist. Because she's walking around and she's like, well, unicorns have cloven hooves. I'm like, really? I had no idea. I just thought they had the horn and could fly maybe. But we went and looked, and this creature that we thought for sure was a horse had cloven hooves. So we have to treat it as a unicorn at that point. Obviously, the old images from Untermyer's archive that are also at the Hudson River Museum, you can see that there was no unicorn horn. So we commissioned the artist to sculpt it with a broken off horn, as it would have been in Untermyer's time. And since then, we also found out that the lion and the unicorn are very prominent in English symbolism and sculpture as well. So we actually think that Untermyer may have gotten this set from England and put it here. The horn may have not made it from England, or it may have fallen into demise since he arrived, but now we have our hornless unicorn because of its cloven feet. The gatehouse itself, we weren't exactly sure what to do with it. And those who have visited Chanticleer Gardens in the past decade outside of Philadelphia, maybe not. An amazing garden, and they had an old ruin of a house that they had torn down, but they built a brand new ruin on top of it. But the walls are new, there's new sculpture there. I don't want to disparage Chanticleer because they're an amazing garden. And if you're in Philadelphia, you certainly should visit. But the ruin's not a ruin, it's brand new. So we thought we would turn the ruin of this old gatehouse into a ruined garden as well. So I'll step back one side, and we thought we could just clean up the soil a little bit. And move from there, and we were gonna screen it out. I had a screen down there, but apparently it was a huge party spot. So beer and wine bottles went down 3 feet. It was just ridiculous amount of debris. So he took the screens away and just started taking wheelbarrows of soil out. We excavated it down to about 2.5, 3 feet, and then brought in nice compost-filled topsoil and turned the space into a garden inside the walls of this roofless gatehouse. So we're having a lot of fun with that. There was graffiti on the interior and exterior. We cleaned up the exterior, but for now we've left the graffiti on the interior. And what I hope to do is over time is maybe find some local street artists, youth in Yonkers, and they could do murals inside. It could be a rotating exhibit, would speak to a different audience, would speak to a good portion of Yonkers as well, and be something that's quite unique to public horticulture that I haven't seen anywhere. But at the meantime, we have the graffiti we inherited. But this old gatehouse provides lots of really interesting vignettes in a semi-shade garden that now has really good soil with no beer bottles in it. There's a little path that goes around the house, and we've knocked some holes in the concrete path and worked with that. And there was something of an old root cellar in this wall that you just can't see here. But we poked some holes in the root cellar and ran some plumbing in there and cast a little concrete basin. And now it's a little water feature, circulating water feature inside the grotto. So when you're down in the ruined garden, there's a little bit of sound of water the entire time. And there's just a quick backup look at the overview of the ruined garden. Making our way back up the hill is one of our bigger, most recent restorations, is what Untermyer called his rock garden. Here we can see images of Untermyer walking through the garden. It looks like a fairly sophisticated garden, lots of diversity in there. Maybe true to what a typical rock garden is, with lots of alpines and small pincushion type plants, lots of sedum in some spots. When we started, we had no idea of how the garden was laid out. We had no maps. All we had were some images that we found at the Smithsonian, including this image of what was obviously labeled as the rock garden, but I couldn't find where it was. And I couldn't find it for the entire first year that I was at the garden. I went in one Saturday afternoon, determined after the first frost, so there were no more leaves on any of the plants after the first hard frost, determined that I would find this garden. The only thing I'm gonna do today is look for the rock garden. It was a big garden in those pictures, and with lots of architecture. There was a stream running through it and everything. Here you can see the original benches that were in the rock garden. Again, these Smithsonian images, a dry laid stone wall. There was a gnome sculpture in there. Obviously that wasn't there, would have made it really easy to find it. And finding a pile of stones that kind of looked like it could have been a water source and what looked like a path that opened up to a belly, which would have been a pool. I was fairly convinced on that Saturday that I had found the old rock garden. So we kept digging and were able to excavate those benches and that dry laid stone wall completely silted in to the very top of it. And then we were able to hire Glencar Water Gardens, who are amazing contractors. They're just up the way in Dutchess County. We've hired them for everything. They helped us redo the rock and stream that ran through Untermyer's rock garden. And then we got to planting. Untermyer called it a rock garden, and for me, that comes with a bit of baggage. So I think of alpine plants only maybe, or dwarf conifers only maybe, or small pin-cushiony plants maybe. I didn't want to be limited just to being a rock garden. And a rock garden is really not a botanical term, right? So it's a bit ambiguous, but people have expectations, I think, when you say you have a rock garden. So we call it the rock and stream garden because I didn't want to be confined by having a rock garden. And I'm not that good to just pull off a rock garden on this scale especially. So we do have areas that maybe fit those traditional plants, but we kind of had fun with it. It's a bit of a prairie ecology style garden too. We started off with just planting our woodies, which I like to do that. And I don't know how you guys approach your gardens, but it was kind of an open space with the recreated stream. And I spent the first year planting woodies and just looked at those. I didn't try to do everything all at once. Is just put all our woody plants in and look at those in the spring. And then that spring turned out to be the spring of the pandemic. When we were closed, we're a private nonprofit. We're not going to be able to have any fundraisers, which is where we get most of our money, our gala events at the garden. We weren't sure what was going to happen. There's a nurseryman that owns a wholesale nursery in Connecticut. It's called The Plant Group. He grew up in Yonkers. He loves what we do. He says, anything you want for the rock and stream garden, look at my list and we'll ship it down to you. So a huge blessing at the beginning of the pandemic was this giant truck showed up and we got all these 1 gallon perennials or bigger, laid them out with an idea of what I wanted to plant. And again, physically laid every pot out. And what I like to do again is do that for a day, look at it for the afternoon. Then I went home and went to bed and came back and looked at it in the morning again to make sure I liked what I had done. Some things I did, some things I didn't. We mixed around and played with those again. And then after the first year of planting, it starts to become a garden thanks to the Plant Group up in Connecticut. Here is more the rock garden side of the rock garden where we have used some more of those traditional plants, but there's other crazy things in there as well. And that started to look a bit like a garden. In fact, I put a juga and heuchera together just to see who would turn their nose up at it almost. But we have lots of fun everywhere we can. The very bottom of the rock and stream garden in Untermyer's day, it just sort of disappeared. The stream disappeared arbitrarily into the ground right next to our Temple of Love, which is a 30-foot waterfall with a giant catch basin next to it. But this rock and stream just stopped. So we thought that didn't make a lot of sense. Again, using Untermyer's ideas and trying to find ways to improve on them, we knocked down some more Norway maples that were in the way, and we pulled that stream from the rock and stream garden that starts up here, again, with that view of the Hudson River. This is where I found the pile of rocks the very first day when I found the garden. We've made it more of a vernal pool. It makes its way down toward the Temple of Love. And what we did is we pulled it all the way across to the catch basin of our Temple of Love, which we'll look at here as well, and gardened all around the stream. And my biggest responsibility with both of these gardens now, the Rock and Stream Garden and the Temple of Love, is to soften up the architecture of that stream. So this is the bottom corner of the stream as it comes down. It formed a triangle next to the Temple of Love. Our working name that we don't publish at the moment is now the Love Triangle of the garden. And it's a bit prairie inspired as well. And there you can see the stream coming from the Rock and Stream Garden down the hill to the Temple of Love, which is probably the second biggest feature in the garden. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition from the Greek Indo-Persian walled garden with all its formality. It's so romantic, so informal, that either one of the gardens could sustain, I think, the park. But to have both of these juxtaposed against each other is a really nice feature there. The original temple on top of the Temple of Love was a Greek temple. We're not sure where that went or what happened to it, but you can see some of Untermyer's staff in front of that temple in his stay. He did switch over to what was, we're sure, a mail order gazebo on top of the temple that you can see in the top of this image. A fairly sophisticated planting coming down a cascade. Lots of weeping, or at least flowering cherries. And this is how we found that gazebo almost ready to topple over. When we arrived, we were able to contract with Haddon Stone, and they did a replica of Untermyer's feature. We also planted some more weeping cherries in there as deference to what Untermyer had done in his day. Here you can see from the 30-foot waterfall looking down toward the Hudson River and that entire garden area along the Cascades, how it looked in his day. This is how we found it in 2011. You couldn't even see the Cascades. I didn't find those even after I found the rock and stream. Completely covered in porcelain berry, more of our friend mugwort, tons of invasive trees, lots of Rosa rugosa as well. We were able to clean that out and recreate the Cascades. We increased the scale a little bit. It is a public garden. We need people to be able to walk through. And quite honestly, I thought the scale of the Cascades going down to the bottom was a bit off to begin with, a bit small compared to this grand feature of the 30-foot cantilevered rock above us. This is a shot from the Love Triangle looking at a calicarpa, which is a purple beautyberry. This one is one called Purple Glam. I love this plant, but it's hard to love it all through the summer. Any of you that do grow it, it's just kind of an ambiguous filler shrub until these purple berries come out on it. But this particular cultivar called Purple Glam does have purple foliage all through the year, so it lets you use it in a slightly different way. There's some sumac behind it looking back at the Temple of Love. But here you can see those cascades as they come down to the Temple of Love. We've tried to use a lot of prairie type planting, so this is sort of its own pollinator garden in a way. This is how it looks in the summer. You can see some of the butterfly weed there amongst other things. In the fall, we've used a ton of asters that come in there, so it turns very purple and blue in the fall as the grasses fade. And every once in a while I just have to remind myself of this view. Like when I go back to work today, I'm doing plumbing to get all this water going, and every once in a while I have to poke myself and say, look over there, there's the Hudson and the Palisades, and you're in a magical place, don't forget it. So those are the historical elements that we have restored. Anybody have any immediate questions on that?
What happened to the house?
So he died in 1940. It took the city 8 years to accept stewardship of the property. So again, there were no formal arrangements, no endowment, everything I mentioned before. The city didn't say yes for 8 years. Whenever they started, perhaps the house was already so deteriorated or just going to be such a maintenance issue moving forward that they did the easy thing and raised it. So it's gone. There's some architectural salvage laying around here and there. Our president, Steve Burns, who is an architect, he's like, the architect wasn't that significant. It was a big Gothic monstrosity where it's just fine that it's gone. I don't exactly feel that way, but my cold comfort in the thing, I mentioned that Bosworth, the Beaux-Arts landscape architect that he hired, would often design around the house or on main axis in a very formal way. Because this property was on the river, and the most important views were down to the river and the Palisades, the gardens were designed much more informally along the hillside, with the river being the most important feature as opposed to the house. So none of the gardens, which we inherited that still exist, have any direct relation to the house based on the design. So the fact that we lost the house is unfortunate, but it didn't impact any of the original layout of the gardens whatsoever. So that's my solace in the whole
I was
thing.
wondering, so what if they open the house for tours?
It would be a really quick tour. Here's the footprint of the house. It had 100 rooms and a swimming pool. And so.
Thank you.
When is the best time to visit? I know the whole year, all year, we do it, but when is the best?
I like to say once our summer annuals, once the annuals get up and big and start showing color, everything comes in. But with all the architecture throughout the property and the river, you're right, there isn't a bad time. But I think from early summer on, and then there are big moments in there as well, but from early to midsummer all the way to hard frost, I think it's good.
As a visitor, can you go into the gardener's house that you made into a greenhouse?
Oh no, it's not a greenhouse, it's a garden. So you should go in. I recommend it. So does anybody have any questions about just what we talked about for those first 10 years?
You were going to talk about the pool, is that
Historical elements, future restoration. And the very first thing is within the walled garden. It is what we are calling the Persian pool. So thank you for the segue. This is how we found it when we started in 2011. It's just below that Corinthian rotunda that we call the Temple of the Sky. And again, from that distance, you won't quite be able to see it. It's well, I think I have some better images here. It was a mosaic swimming pool in Untermyer's day, up to 6 feet deep in places. After Untermyer's day, you can see here, it became a compost pile and debris dump, filled all the way to the top. In the 70s, there was an effort at a restoration, and you can see volunteers hand digging out this giant swimming pool with shovels, and the pile's bigger than they are. They're down in the deep end digging this out. But there was a studio that was hired, and interestingly, an apprentice on this project is who we're working right now to do the restoration. So he may touch it as an apprentice, and he may restore it as the owner of the studio, as we see now. But there was that, I'm gonna back up one second. You can just see a ripple motif that was in the mosaic running along the floor of the pool. There were sea creatures populated throughout that ripple motif. And then the wall had 2 different wave motifs going along the side of the wall. So it was completely and well restored in the 70s. We were able to find some evidence that when the contractors came in, they said the substrate isn't quite stable enough. We'd like to do X, Y, and Z before we put the mosaic in. The city said the budget is the budget, let's see the mosaic. And so that might have been a part of the problem, that it was a bit unsettled underneath. Here you can see some of those sea creatures as we found them before it had further deteriorated 10 years ago. But they were told to move forward with it. And so any movement at all, and it's mosaic 6 feet down in places. So if there's one crack, and we've seen this up at ground level in places, if there's one crack in the grout of the mosaic in the winter, and a little bit of water gets in there and it freezes, now that one tiny crack is turned into 6 cracks. And then the sun comes out, warms it up, more water gets in there, and it exponentially grows and just starts to blow the mosaic apart from its substrate. As you can see here, as it happened with that particular fish and those weeds. So this is largely what we're looking at now. It's interesting in this Indo-Persian garden that the swimming pool is in a ziggurat Persian shape as well. So again, why we're calling it the Persian pool. And what we hope to do, we already have all the architectural drawings, we've talked to contractors, bids have gone out. We hope to break ground this spring, is rather than being a swimming pool, because we're a public garden that's open free of charge to the public every day but major holidays. We can't afford a lifeguard, and I don't want to put a big fence in there. So we're going to raise the floor up to 18 inches, similar to how it is in our canals. We'll redo the mosaic completely. And again, we can't salvage that mosaic in every piece and redo that. What will happen is the apprentice from the first restoration has already been working with Italy, and he'll come up with the design, and Italy will put together sheets, kind of like you go buy your backsplash at Home Depot. They'll send the sheets over all rolled up, and then it'll be his job to lay it out and grout it in as we go there. So we're gonna lose the bottom wave motif on the wall, but we're able to restore the top one. And just so I'm being honest here are the architectural drawings for the restoration that should be happening this spring. So we're in good shape on that. Stepping away from the Persian pool, back all the way down, and you may have heard me mention the Rose and Dahlia Gardens when I was looking at the map the first time when we were looking at the map. So the Rose and Dahlia Garden was a transition garden from the bottom of the vista out to the Italian vegetable garden. And we'll take a look at the Italian vegetable garden, but it was a 7-terrace garden with a fancy vegetable garden, big fancy vegetable garden. And the Rose and Dahlia garden was sort of a hallway, the transition garden to get from the vista to the Italian vegetable garden. This is how we found the Rose and Dahlia garden. So the dahlias probably were for cut flowers, and the roses may be the same. You can see the remnants of the pergola here in 8 feet of weeds, including a lot of artemisia as well. We were able to clean that spot up, and we really weren't sure what we were going to do with it. It's interesting architecturally. You can see there its proximity to the vista, the view it has of the Hudson River. In the background is the nursing home, which is a bit of a problem. You can see in this particular image, there's some young arborvitae that are there to, before we knew what we were going to do, we knew we wanted to screen the nursing home. So we planted those trees right away. And we were trying to figure out what to do. And I mentioned there was this vegetable garden that it led to. So what was the vegetable garden is now that nursing home. And here you can see this 7-terrace vegetable garden. It had 2 Italian pergolas that were looking out toward the river. There was a cobalt tile water reel going through. So it was these 14 beds of vegetables on the far corner from the house. So again, Bosworth and Untermyer didn't exactly have a kitchen garden. But it was on the far away from the house, and now it's underneath the nursing home. And we're not going to get that back. There is some still remnants of the architecture, but we're not going to get that back. So we're thinking about what to do with this rose and dahlia garden. We don't really need a bunch of roses or a bunch of dahlias. I don't want to turn it into a rose garden or a cut flower garden in a public horticulture. So we were thinking, let's honor the vegetable garden and plant a vegetable garden. And Steve Burns, our president again, he's an architect, so he thinks in 2 dimensions, right? And I'm being disparaging a little bit. And he loves Villandry. Does anybody know Villandry in France? It's a giant vegetable garden. Everything's parterre, so it's all the trimmed boxwood, and then there's a tomato inside one bed of the boxwood. You know, all tomatoes, and it's all lettuce here. So it's beautiful in its own way, but it's very formal, and it's not how, I'm from Missouri. I don't want a garden like I'm from France. So we knew we wanted to do an ornamental vegetable garden. And when those words came out of his mouth, he could only think of these parterres, these formal 2-dimensional shapes. I was thinking, oh, let's do big borders, but with vegetables. So we were kind of having a back and forth, and we didn't have to make the decision yet. And then there was one early snow that happened on a fairly warm fall day, and the snow came down, and can you see the shapes there? So it's edging that Untermyer had in the old rose and dahlia garden that revealed its shapes. I'm like, damn it, I just lost that argument about having formal shapes, because I'm not going to ignore what Untermyer had done. We want to tell his stories. So there were these shapes that emerged in the snow that, thinking about Rock and Stream Garden and the whole idea with the vegetable garden, we wanted Yonkers youth to come help us with this. So we had already started an intern program. So the first set of interns came in and helped us excavate all that edging to see exactly what the shapes and the patterns were, and things started to make sense. Again, some of the paths were only big enough for one person to walk on, but we took the idea of what we found there, which was a lot of different circles, and we have the circles of the columns, and we have the circle of the vista base, and all of these columns as well. So there's a lot of circles happening. So we went up with spray paint and played with that a lot and did some drawings and came up with this. So it's not exactly as fancy as Villandry. It's a bit more circilinear. It's certainly unique. It's in an asymmetrical, everything at Untermyer is asymmetrical too. It looks so formal and rigid, but nothing is on center anywhere. So we had fun with these beds. So everything you see there inside those gray lines, which is our new paths, will be vegetables. Exactly how we do it, I think it'll be kind of blousy. I don't know. I don't think it'll be boxwood hedges. And below that, and that's a big space, what we just looked at. So that's plenty of vegetables for interns to grow. And we're gonna work with the local high school who has a culinary program and get some of the produce on their tables so they can get that into their curriculum. And we're all gonna look for there's plenty of food scarcity in Yonkers as well. So we're already figuring out how to distribute as much as we can produce from the vegetable garden. So that's a big space. But then we have this lower space, part of the rose and dahlia garden. And this is where that snow had melted and we could see the shapes. We've turned this into a small orchard to match what had our vegetable garden. We restored that pergola that was covered in weeds. So now you can see that the cedar pergola. We will put I think mainly vegetables, big squash hanging down and stuff. But because it was a rose and dahlia garden, there will be some roses there. And then I just love these patterns, this shape that was part of Untermyer's. I mean, they are irresistible, unique shapes. And that's exactly what Untermyer had left. So to restore that was a lot of fun. And just a beauty shot looking up that stone steps toward the pergola. And last year we planted clover as a cover crop until we can start growing vegetables. And this is an artist rendition of what that space may look like. In the foreground there is a hardy Russian pomegranate, which is already in the ground. So we're gonna have a few of those in the pergola and such in the background. There was along that wall, and you can see our arborvitae have gotten a bit taller. We're closer to losing the nursing home, but not quite yet. But Untermyer built this wall around an oak tree that had been there. We found some of the stump in there, but it was long gone, and we needed to make a transition down into this lower border, which we've been calling the lawn garden. So we had a local mason come use concrete and pour these circle stairs, which you may have seen them at different places, but there's a garden in the Vatican where we think it might have been the first time that these stairs emerged. So we've kind of played with that. The architect figured that one out too. And so this is what we're hoping we turn that lawn garden into. You can see the rose and dahlia garden, which is now the vegetable and orchard garden, up on that wall. And here we're just going to do a nice double border and maybe lots of herbs to complement the vegetable garden. Coming back up the hill from that just a little bit were Untermyer's original color gardens. You can see on this map, there are 3 of them in white and 2 in yellow with inside that circle. The hospital owns property where 3 of those gardens currently are. These were monochromatic color gardens. Again, probably lots of bedding, but there was a white garden, a yellow garden, a blue garden, a red garden, and so on down the hill. This is how it looked in Untermyer's day. It's very terraced. Each garden had its own terrace. This is the lowermost terrace with some of the staff by the fountain. This is how we found that fountain in 2011. Again, completely overgrown. And started to clean it up and get an idea. You can see the lowest color garden does look at the vista, and when you get up the wall, you're looking right down on the vegetable garden and those 2-dimensional shapes of those beds we just talked about. In its day, there were sculptures throughout and several water features as well. So we're hoping to restore that to some degree. 3 of these gardens, like I said, are on hospital land of St. John's. 2 of them are just in an overgrown area that they don't care about. 1 of them is in an area where they park 14 cars. So it's a bit of a parking lot, but we have a land in the same spot. We could give them 14 parking spots and get this back and put all those color gardens together. So that's something we're actively working on right now. And we're hoping the color gardens might look something like this moving into the future with, again, capturing that view to the river in the foreground. I think the last garden that Untermyer had worked on that we haven't even touched yet is Untermyer's sundial garden. This is an old newspaper clipping advertising or regaling the garden as the world's largest living sundial, which doesn't really turn me on, but it sounds interesting. And here you can see how that sundial sat in proportion to the river and the Palisades in the background. Here's Untermyer's head gardener setting his timepiece to the sundial. So I'm not sure what the hedging material that formed the gnomon or the pin was. And then it's described as rock garden plants marked the hours, and there were Roman numerals planted out. So it's all a little bit hokey to me. And I'm sure this was not a Bosworth design. I think it was just something fun. And hokey's fun. I just said earlier, you gotta have fun or there's no point in doing it. So they thought it was fun, but growing Roman numerals with rock garden plants doesn't sound that fun to me. So what we're gonna do, and the other thing, this garden was right in the elbow of the rock and stream garden we looked at earlier and the Temple of Love. So it's right in proximity to two gardens that are connected by water that have a similar aesthetic. And then there's this sundial that's right there in the middle of it. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna move the sundial away a little bit, and we're gonna have fun with the materials rather than growing plants. Those of you that have been down to the Central Park Conservatory Garden and know the Dancing Maiden sculpture that's the centerpiece, that was Untermyer's sculpture. It sat immediately outside the front porch of the now raised mansion that's gone. And Untermyer did leave that to the Central Park Conservancy. When Betsy Barlow Rogers, who kind of formed the Central Park Conservancy, came to visit us to see what we were doing, because we were asking her tons of questions, because her model of what she did with the city down there, we wanted to learn from that. And I asked her too, it's like, so when do we get the Dancing Maidens back? And she laughed even harder than the Hudson River Museum did. And she's like, yeah, forget it. She barely even talked to me. But so this was a fountain that had the Dancing Maidens in it. You can see a young son of Samuel Untermyer Jr. with his governess there, and they're standing on the coping stone of where this Dancing Maiden sculpture was. It's this beautiful stone carved in a circle. It's still existing there. It's just kind of out in an open lawn with a flagpole in the middle of it. So we're going to harvest that stone to be the circle around our new sundial. We're going to push it a little bit deeper into the woods so it's not right there in that elbow next to the other two gardens. It may even become something of a shade dial. And we found some of the architectural salvage laying around from the house when it was raised that we want to make the gnomon out of that. We found a bunch of interesting stone that can mark the hours. And so it'll be a bit more of a sculpture than a garden. And it'll be a little bit more well placed in relation to everything else that's going on at the garden. So that's something we may even start on this year as well, in addition to the Persian pool, is recreating the sundial. We want to tell Untermyer's story again, but we just think we might have a better way to do it, at least for now. So those are all the gardens that Untermyer had worked on that we haven't gotten to yet. And then I'll quickly go through some of the non-historical elements that we want to add to the space. Here we have our lower switchback at the bottom in the deep woodlands. It's a corner of the gardens that nobody gets to right now. There are some nice paths going in there, and it is a nice spot with potential views of the river too. So we want to turn this into our ornamental woodland, and it may actually be a stumpery. We found these carved stone steps down in that area, and it goes to a very flat space, but we're not sure what Untermyer had there. Maybe it was that Greek temple that was on top of the Temple of Love that we saw earlier, but it's sort of a mystery right now. And then we found this fountain basin, which we're right now in the middle of restoring this basin. So we're gonna have running water in this fountain down there. You can see it's very woodland down at the southwest corner of the garden. And what we're hoping to do where those stone steps were is to build a little hermitage. And that'll go along with the fountain basin that we have there. And then if you turn around in this image and sort of look back up the hill, inspired a lot by Prince Charles' stumpery at Highgrove Gardens, as we've already started collecting stumps. You can see Liz moving one into place. And we hope to turn that whole woodland area into a very whimsical, fun woodland garden with stumpery and other collected wood and other silly, creative, fun ideas to do with wood. We haul so much wood to the wood dump. I'd rather like have fun with it than get rid of it. So that's a garden that you'll start to see turn a corner in the next year or two. The next area that has been a bit of an eyesore, it's really our invasives collection. So it's just below the meadow here, and you can see a beautiful, one of the largest Kusa dogwoods I've ever seen. But just beyond that, you can see the mown grass, which is kind of meadow. But when we stop mowing the grass, it's all mugwort. It's all phragmites in the wet areas, and then it's all a super aggressive cultivar with species with extra large leaves of Japanese knotweed. So it's like the trifecta of what the hell am I going to do with this? This is a view looking down to that where we had mowed it for a few years and we mowed some paths in it and we'd gotten some rudbeckia in there, but it all came back mugwort and Japanese knotweed as well. So we have these terraces going down the vista that's part of the view shed of the walled garden, and we're going to start getting very aggressive this year of eradicating the invasives and putting in a meadow, a primarily native meadow in that particular spot. And then stepping all the way back across the garden, it's the last feature of what we're trying to restore, is what we're calling the quiet garden. This is just below the footprint of the original house. So the original house set here, and there's actually a giant stone retaining wall that's there, which is quite a feature on the river side, and creates this interesting little bowl. You can see the hard line on the right, and just through those trees is the Temple of Love as well. There's the balustrade and that stone wall. You can see just some pooled water in the bottom, so we'd like to put in a pond in the bottom of that bowl where it collects water, and create. Steve Burns, again, the guy that wanted to do Volandre, he's like, let's do a Japanese garden. And I said, we're not in Japan, so we can't do a Japanese garden. So we can take inspiration from a Japanese garden, but I don't want to do a Japanese garden in the middle of Yonkers. It's too incongruous. And again, confines me a little bit much. I can't cover my mistakes as well. So we'll take the idea of the solitude and the quietness of a Japanese garden, I think, and recreate it in a different way in this particular spot. there's a chance we could still open up a view to the river. It'll relate to the Temple of Love, and we'll have that giant stone wall that speaks to Untermyer's original house there in the background. So that's everything we're trying to do, and we wouldn't be doing it without Untermyer. And there were some people along the way that brought it full circle to what it is now. Does the name T.H. Everett mean anything to anybody?
The name
T.H. Everett?
Oh,
Oh yeah, so
English gardener.
English gardener. I learned about him when I was studying horticulture as the grandfather of American horticulture. But Untermyer, he had a staff of 60 gardeners, as I mentioned. So he's always needing new gardeners if you're keeping a staff of 60. He would send agents down to the docks looking to recruit trained English gardeners as they were coming into the country. T.H. Everett is one of those gardeners, and he spent his first 2 years in the States working at Untermyer Gardens. He then went to do some private work for a period, and then he ended up at New York Botanical Garden, where he sort of redefined their horticulture approach, and he started the schools, the education program there. So the Professional Gardener School came out of that. All the classes that any one of us could go take right now at New York Botanical Garden are all a result of T.H. Everett's influence at New York Botanical Garden. One of the gardeners that came through his class while he was teaching the professional gardening program was Marco Polo Stefano, who is the recently retired director of horticulture at Wave Hill. He's the gentleman that turned Wave Hill into Wave Hill. T.H. Everett was approached by the city of New York when they were looking for a head gardener to start that project. T.H. recommended his student Marco, who then chartered Wave Hill to become a world-renowned garden in and of itself. My name doesn't belong with those two guys' names, but I had the opportunity to work with Marco, and whenever Steve Burns was looking for a gardener at Untermyer, Marco suggested me, and that's how I got my foot in the door toward that job. So again, I don't belong with those two, but the fact that T.H. Everett started at Untermyer Gardens, he handed the torch to Marco, and it comes all the way back to Untermyer Gardens now as a fascinating part of my daily life that I wanted to share. And the people behind all of this are what make these gardens happen as much as anything. And then finally, if you'll bear with me, how we approach every day at the garden, I just wanted to share a quote from Untermyer's notes that how he approached gardening as well. He says, "This gigantic landscaping task, never quite finished, is an unfailing outlet for abundant creative energy. There is always something more to do, something that can be bettered. Indeed, one great advantage of creating of gardens over other kinds of creative work is that you never finished. When you do a painting or a piece of sculpture, it is done. You may enjoy it all your life, but work on it again you cannot. A garden, on the other hand, is a literal world perennially in process of creation." And that's how we try to approach every day at the garden, and I hope you all can approach your gardens in the same way. And I appreciate your time and your patience and letting me share this story.